Welcome to our second lecture on death. And today we're going to talk about death in Rajasthan and Tamil Nadu. And I'll tell you where those are in just a minute. So we're going to go over death rituals again today, and particularly compare what we saw in Benares to what we can see in Rajasthan to the west. And to wrap things up, we're going to talk about death rituals in Tamil Nadu and specifically talk about the roles of gender in these types of death performances. So what regions are we talking about here? Now, we started out exploring the details of death rituals in Benares, and those death rituals could all in entirety be performed in the city of Benares because the Ganges River was right there. You'll notice the theme of water that I have in this PowerPoint presentation, because we'll see that Ganges water in particular comes up in a lot of different contexts. So I like to think about the Benares rituals being sort of like the starting point for all the other sources. Perry described them so clearly and in depth that we can really use those as our baseline to look at the phenomenon elsewhere. I've marked it with a big X in the upper right. There you see Varanasi. Varanasi is another name for Benares. Now, the cases we're going to look at today are death rituals in Rajasthan in particular, but also in Tamil Nadu. So Rajasthan, that's the X over to the west, and we're looking at a place called Gatiali. Gatiali is just sort of right around Jodhpur. So in Rajasthan, we're going to look at the death rituals, also a short pilgrimage that's used to sink the flowers. What that means is to deposit the bone remains after the cremation into a holy river, specifically here, the Ganges, but they'll do this in sort of far up in the north in a place called Hardwar. I'll talk about that in a second. So in Tamil Nadu, we're actually going to look at untouchables, so folks who are outside of the caste system, and we're going to look at how they offer weeping services, sort of ritual mournings, and also they perform in funeral processions, sort of funeral parades. The Tamil context is really interesting down in Tamil Nadu because it provides a deeper level of emotional context and subjectivity than we found elsewhere. Our anthropologist, Clark Desais, was able to really talk about the interior life of those people who perform these rituals. So Anne Gold and Clark Desais, who was originally named, well, her maiden name was Nabokov, and we're going to read her again when we get to the ritual on, or the module on possession. So both of them are anthropologists. Gold's book is called Fruitful Journeys, The Ways of Rajasthani Pilgrims, and this is a classic study. It's sort of timeless. I really like working with it. I find new things in it every time. She did her field research in the 1980s, but her insights into village life are still teaching us quite a bit. Now, Clark Desais is writing a follow-up to her classic study of possession. It's called Religion Against the Self, and we're going to read about that in our section on possession. In this book, it's different from her book, Religion Against the Self, when she was studying possession rituals. In this book, she sort of just takes an apartment. This is after she'd finished her PhD work. She's a full-grown professor. She takes an apartment in an untouchable area, an area where untouchables live, and she starts really talking to informants who perform rituals surrounding funerals, namely performative mourners and musicians. Sadly, Clark Desais died in 2017, tragically, while she was guiding student field research in India. She took a fall in North India and ended up dying of it. The first time I taught this book, I wasn't aware that she died. I was teaching it in 2017, in fact. I was teaching a class on death and Hinduism at another university. And I found out that she had died, and I just sort of waited until sort of one moment in class, the students were kind of looking something up on their laptops. And one said, wait a minute, she died, our author died. So we were talking about death rituals, and then suddenly we found that our author had died, which is sort of poignant. All right, so let's dig into the context of Gatiali and Anne Gold's work. This is in Rajasthan. And the first thing I want to talk about is the death of a man named Mangilal Mishra. Now, he died at a ripe old age with a son to replace him, and we're going to be reading about his death rituals today. Now, Mangilal Mishra was known to be a very good dude. He had a full-grown son. In fact, his death rituals were, for the most part, upbeat. The only one who really openly grieves actively that Gold observes is his widow. What does this say about gender? Constantly think about gender throughout this, and how there's gender that's baked into sort of the way that folks react to these death rituals. As we'll see, women perform a great sense of loss, whereas men remain stoic. So there's certain parts in Gold where you'll read that the men go outside because the women are inside weeping and wailing. So while some women would perform the mourning, they're performing their and when I say performing, I'm not saying that these aren't genuine feelings. I'm saying that they just they get into that mindset of really, it's time to mourn. So now we're going to mourn, and they kind of whip themselves up into it. But the wife seems genuinely distraught. Now that's a problem, as we've seen throughout, because calling to the deceased and weeping to the deceased will actually call forth the ghost of the deceased, forcing them to remain longer, or call forth other ghosts that can cause afflictions. All right, so what is his death? What is the death of this Mangilal Mishra? Well, Mangilal's demise was signaled by his inability or his refusal to eat food. Remember, he stopped eating. So Gold notes that Jonathan Perry described that the soon to die will refuse food to sort of weaken any resistance to the departure of the spirit. Gold notes that while many people as they're dying will sort of start rejecting or refusing food, but at the same time, the relatives will always kind of be trying to keep them eating or offering them food. So again, there's always some ambiguity here. A local Brahmin was called forth to read the Bhagavad Gita. As Mangilal was dying, he was given a few drops of Ganges water into his mouth and a basil leaf, which you saw also in Benares. And all this happens as he lies dying. Next, he's laid out on the floor, and many folks come to greet him for the last time. This presumably was done outdoors, but Gold is not really clear on this. She notes that the ground and the earth is considered to be pure for a couple of reasons. One, the ground, Prithvi, the earth is a goddess in and of herself. Also, Gold notes a statement by McKim Marriott that says that the ground is inherently pure because you can take defiled or bad water and you can pour it onto the earth, and then it goes down to the water table, and it's basically recycled. The earth is a purifier, which they see because stuff like urine is put on the ground, dishwater, washing water, water from your bath is poured into the ground, and then it's purified as it goes down and seeps through the ground and into the water table to be drawn up into wells again later. So the earth is inherently purifying, which makes me also think about how we have a notion in the West of the earth being purifying, and considering the way that we bury our dead, the way that we bury our trash. We have a sense that when you put something under the ground, it's either removes its impurities, or I'm still kicking that idea around about how we in the West think of earth and the ground as a purifying thing. And you could even trace this back further. I know I have a number of friends who do taxidermy and collect bones, and they've said one of the best ways to clean bones is you take the corpse of an animal and you bury it in the earth, and then go dig it up in like 6 months, and it's perfectly clean. The earth and the bugs and the whatnot have cleaned all the flesh. So there is something there about how the earth cleanses in the West as well. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. It's just something I'm kind of thinking about. All right, so the local Brahmin comes and reads the Gita. So as he's dying, he's hearing the holy words of Krishna and the Bhagavad Gita. He's given a few drops of Ganges water and a basil leaf, and presumably he dies. He stops breathing. So he's sitting outside, or he's positioned outside, and Gold notes that a person shouldn't die on a bed because a bed is somehow between the earth and the sky. They should be directly on the earth. And if you're in a between space, like as if you're high up on a bed, then you're in a confusing spot. Spirit might be confused because it can't really decide if it is heading up to the sky, or if it is heading, or not if it's heading to the earth, or if it is resting on the earth. Intermediate spots are considered confusing for the souls. I'm not sure exactly when he dies, but as we've noted throughout this, the actual moment of death and the separation of the soul from the body is found in numerous locations in all of these rituals. So a whole bunch of folks will come, and a lot of male friends will come, and they'll start to make the stretcher, the bier, that Mangilal will be carried upon when he heads out to the cremation ground. We note here that only the family will touch the body. Now, at this time, women will spend their time wailing and weeping while the men begin the ritual preparation. And I'd love to know more about what they're thinking, why they weep and whatnot. But Gold doesn't give us that. She's more interested in describing the rituals and figuring out the structures of the rituals than the interior subjectivity of the women who are wailing. For that, we'll turn to Nabokov or Clark de Sales. Anyway, so the corpse is tied to the stretcher, the bier, and various pindas or dough ball offerings, which we'll hear more about, are placed on his hands and his feet. We do not see the same placement of the 6 pindas in Peri, where they make 6 offerings of the 6 sort of greatly impure pindas at different spots in the religious procession. But we do see that there are offerings that are placed of pindas on the heads and hand of the corpse. Now, does this mean that they didn't make those offerings? I don't know. Maybe Gold just didn't see it. Maybe Gold wasn't able to actually go completely along because she was a woman, though she has pretty good access in this case study. It's hard to say. So the procession begins to go into the street and the men chant, Ram Nam Satya He, Satya Boya Gatta He, which means something like the name of God is truth. And then Satya Boya Gatta He means like, as long as this truth is spoken, and I think Boya is Bola, then there is passage. So this truth clears the way. So they go down across, they start, doing the procession with the men chanting, Ram Nam Satya He, Satya Boya Gatta He. We don't hear about a band or a procession like we see in Peri and Clark de Sales. We don't see about a funeral, but who knows? The procession stops at a specific big temple. This is the temple to the 4-armed Vishnu. Now, the 4-armed Vishnu in this particular village of Gattiali is open to all groups, and it is also known to oversee political consensus and dharma in the village. So if there's a conflict, all the elders will get together and they will consult the 4-armed Vishnu as to what they need to do to restore peace in the village. Now, they also stop at a temple to Bhairuji. Now, Bhairuji is Bhairava, the wrathful Shiva, or just sort of this local deity named Bhairava, the terrifying one, who we find all over the place. He's a very important deity here in Gattiali. In particular, this one is called the Middle Dwelling Bhairuji, and his temple is halfway between the edge of the village and the cremation ground. At Bhairuji, they offer the barley flour balls. So they offer the Pinda dolls here, which makes sense, making offerings to Bhairava, who is very much a lord of ghosts. Bhairava is a Bhutnak, a lord of the ghosts. He's an imminent ghost lord type. So Bhairava's here. Like you can interact with Bhairava. You give him offerings, and he'll scare off the ghosts. Now, 4-armed Vishnu is a more sort of like transcendent god. So we've talked about immanent and transcendent, local and translocal. Here we'll notice they first go and visit the 4-armed Vishnu, the great grand Vishnu, but then on the way to the cremation ground, they stop at Bhairuji, who's a scarier type god, a more ambivalent type god, and they give him Pinda dough ball offerings. All right, so they head to the cremation ground and the men begin to build a pyre out of wood and cow dung. Now, here we do not see a cast of domes. We actually see a bunch of Brahmins and helpers to Brahmins that are doing all the tasks that are required. This is as if pollution has been mediated here in a different way than in Benares. I mean, Rajasthan has a different social dynamic. So there is no cast of domes. So you don't have the dome Raj and you don't have the dome helpers that do the really impure things in the rituals. Why? Because they're not there. Also because caste differentiation is really different over here in Rajasthan. So you don't have a caste that's there to fulfill that group. So in this sense, you actually have Brahmins that are doing these sort of impure things or these things that might be impure, but they don't seem too worried about it. The first thing they do is they pull off the burial shroud and they cover the body in dung cakes. The son, named Ladu Ram, will light the first fire. And he is seen to be notably weeping. He's trying to be stoic, but he's broken up about losing his beloved fathers. The others then around will light grass torches and they will light the pyre that's made of wood and dung cakes. Now, you might be thinking, why are they burning the body with animal dung? Well, cow dung is considered inherently pure as one of the panchamrita, the 5 good things that come out of a cow. So when we're talking about, they cook with cow dung, they burn bodies with cow dung is used to do a whole lot of stuff. And while we might find that animal excrement repellent, they collect the cow dung, they dry it, and they use it as a very common fuel for household use. All right. So a Brahmin reads various Sanskrit verses while they make different offerings into the flames. And at an appropriate moment, Ladu Ram, the eldest son, uses a long-handed spoon to pour ghee or clarified butter into the skull of the deceased after it is cracked in the heat. So they heat that body, they heat the body, and the body just cracks. And you can actually see this happen. I've been at a cremation and watched it happen, where the heat reaches a certain point and the body is cooked just enough that the head just sort of makes this funny popping noise, and then out bubbles a bit of, head matter and brains and whatnot. It is considered that it's a really striking moment. So here, when that happens, there's sort of a hole in the skull after the brains have kind of bubbled out, and he pours with this long-handled spoon clarified butter offerings into the skull. All right, so that's a big deal. This is the moment when the death taboo really starts for the next 10 days. Some people say this is when the spirit really leaves the body, but if that's the case, why do we keep working and doing all these other rituals? So it continues. Finally, all the men and lastly Ladu Ram give a final bow, a pranam to the corpse, and then they leave the funeral ground. They go and they bathe, and then they go to the forearm Vishnu again, then they go back to the house of the deceased. Meanwhile, during all of this time, the women have been cleaning the death room, replastering the floor with cow dung. The floors will be smeared with cow dung that actually hardens and makes a really nice surface to stand on, or to just kind of live around. Some of you might be thinking that this would smell bad. It doesn't. It really doesn't. The way that they process the cow dung means it has virtually very little smell whatsoever. Okay, so they've cleaned and replastered the floor with cow dung. And one of the things they do is they throw flour on the floor right where the person died, wherever they decide that is, and then they cover it with a tray. Later, they will then look to find a symbol on the floor. Here, they actually see the symbol of an Om symbol, which I'm quite sure somebody sneaks in at some point and marks an Om and then puts the platter back. But that's the way ritual works. So while the men were doing this cremation, the women don't go along. In fact, they go arm in arm to the forearm Vishnu, and they go there and they weep and they wail and they make a big show of things. Then they return and tons of folks come to visit the widow. The men are thought to be sort of stoic ritual performers, but the women are thought to present, or are said to present, loss and grief. And we'll see these roles complicated when we talk about them in Tamil Nadu. Okay, so what about the flowers? Well, the individual mourner, here Ladu Ram, will go and take a single set of flowers or bones to the Ganges. He's going to go on a sort of mini pilgrimage, and I've marked it here. So he's right outside of Jaipur, Jodhpur there. I've marked it with an X, and he goes up to Uttaranchal, which is the name of a state, to a town called Hardwar, or Haridwara, which means the gateway to the Lord Hari, which is a holy city on the banks of the Ganges up in the mountains. He's able to go there in one day. So in other occasions, an individual mourner, the eldest son, won't go. It will be that, okay, now let me put this in another way. All right, so in this case, Ladu Ram collects the flowers, the bones that are left over after the cremation, and he takes them up to Hardwar and he deposits them in the river and he does a ritual. In the past, you couldn't just do this at any time, but lots of people would go to Hardwar on religious pilgrimage. So a lot of folks would collect all the flowers together and they would keep them in the house in a prideful place, in a good, glorious place in the house. And then when somebody was going on the pilgrimage, they would either get the flowers and go along with people going on pilgrimage, or they might send someone to deposit the flowers on their behalf on a pilgrimage route. So in Benares, all of the remaining bones and ashes would be just swept into the Ganges. The Rajasthanis don't go to Benares. That would be much further. They actually head north to Hardwar or Prayag, And there, the river, the Ganges River, is actually closer to the mountains. And in fact, it's much, 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 much cleaner there. In fact, they say in the olden days, people would save the flowers and shrine in the house for sometimes years. Then when they would send the flowers along with folks who are doing a pilgrimage. Previously, it would have been impossible to get to Hardwar and back in time to do the rituals on the 12th day. In this way, people are able to condense ritual activities to do greater technological ease. He leaves on like the 4th, so he can be back to do and he's back on like the 6th or the 7th, so he can do the rituals on the 10th and the 12th day, which are essential. It's just cool that they can now take trains and buses and head up and do the ritual and get back in time to deposit those bone flowers in the Ganges and then do the rest of the rituals. All right. So on the 3rd day after cremation, Ladu Ram, the eldest son, goes to the cremation grounds and he collects the requisite bone fragments. He gathers up the bones that are left afterwards. He mounds up all the other remains and offers them rice and milk. This is an offering sort of to the spirit of the deceased. He places the flowers or those bone fragments in a clay pot that is temporarily placed in his home while he prepares for his journey. On the 4th day, Ladu Ram makes offerings to the clay pot, and then he goes off to Hardwar with the flowers on his person. First, he washes the flowers in milk, and then he offers them cooked food. He bows down to the flowers just as he did to his father when his father was alive. He places the flowers, or remember we're talking about bones, in a newly sewn bag. Then he hides that bag under his clothing, not wanting to make a big show of the fact what he's doing, because anybody that sees a Rajasthani walking toward Hardwar, carrying a pouch around their neck, knows exactly what they're up to. He proceeds shoeless, but he does wear thick socks. He argues that he doesn't want to wear shoes on pilgrimage for fear of stepping on small and tiny bugs or crushing plants and whatnot and causing violence while he is doing his pilgrimage. Your pilgrimage should be as free from violence as possible. So he and a couple of his pals, including Anne Gold and one of her interpreters, goes off to Hardwar. It takes a full day. They take trains and the buses, they get to Hardwar, and the first thing they do is go to a dharamsala, which is a pilgrim's rest house. Here, he contacts and meets up with a person called a punda. This is not to be confused with a pundit. A pundit is a scholar. A punda is a pilgrimage guide. Yes, it's spelled like panda, but with little dots on the N and D, it becomes punda. Punda with a retroflex, not and punda. So he meets with these pundas. And the thing that happens first is the punda is also an expert in the genealogy and rituals of a specific clan. So this punda who he meets with will help him do the rituals to sink the flowers, who will also record his pilgrimage in a specific logbook that shows the records of his clan and his family. So the punda is able to kind of like figure out who he is, and they go through a couple of rounds of trying to figure this out. And finally the punda is like, oh, you're this guy. And then he reads out his father's name and his father's name and records that the last pilgrimage that was, and declares that the last pilgrimage that was done there was 17 years ago, which is directly correct, according to Madhulal. So Madhulal's like, all right, this is my guy. And then they sit around and they fill out all the marriages and deaths that have happened in the family since the last time anybody was talking to this punda. And this is all recorded in these special logbooks. Next thing that happens is he waits until morning, and then Madhulal has his head shaved, and then he goes and he deposits the bone flowers into the river along with his father's favorite walking stick. This will become important later. He also purchases a sealed container of Ganga water. It's a large brass container that is filled with Ganges Ganga water and is sealed up with wax. It's a large brass pot sealed with wax, and it will be used in the worship of the Ganges River that is done after the final pinned offering on the 12th day. So he actually does a pinned offering helped by the punda, and then he a little bit there in Hardwar, and then he deposits the bone flowers, and then he's on his way. Now Madhulal stops in Pushkar, which is a traditional stop on pilgrimage. And there he buys 2 walking sticks. One is a new walking stick for himself to take back to Hardwar, and the other he gives to a beggar. And it's thought that this walking stick that was given as a gift to a beggar will allow Madhulal's father or Ladu Ram's father to have that walking stick in the great beyond. All right, so Ladu Ram is, I keep saying Madhulal, but Ladu Ram the names are sort of similar, is not bothered by the contradiction that his father's spirit is still thought to be hovering around, but his father's spirit is also thought to be in the great beyond and able to receive the stick. There's always these ambiguities. Where is the soul? Is it still near the body? Is it hovering around the place he died? Is it hovering around the chief mourner? Has it gone to the great beyond? It's hard to say. All right, so he gets back home and they begin the next set of rituals. The thing he needs to do here is the preparations for the 12th day. Remember, on the 12th day, there is all a bunch of stuff that has to happen, and they do the pinned offerings and whatnot. So in the preparations for the 12th day, Nadu Ram has returned. He is once again shaved. He shaves his beard, his head, his underarms, all these are shaved. Yes, okay, women do a bathing ritual, and they also offer ritualized offerings of water to the deceased and make preparation for a large funeral feast that will happen on the 12th day. On the eve of the 12th day, they have an all-night thing called a jagrat or a jagran, in which people sing sort of holy songs all night long. All right, on the 12th day, they do the Sapindi Shraddha Kriya, or the Sapindi Karana, so the offering of the little pinda balls. All right, here it's a 2-hour ritual that is actually done in the room where Mangi Lal died. So folks assemble a large tray with all sorts of different offerings, and the Brahmin who performed the cremation comes to oversee the rituals. What I'd like you to do right now is to hit pause, and I would like you to read pages 91 to 94. I could just read these to you, but that seems sort of silly. So hit pause on the video and go read pages 91 to 94 to read about the Sapindi Shraddha Kriya offerings, the Sapindi Karana, that are very similar, but done a little bit differently than we saw in Perry. So hit pause, go read pages 91 to 94 in Ann Gold's wonderful book that you have on PDF, 91 to 94. And we're back. Okay, so what's really exciting, at least to me, from reading this passage is to see that we saw the exact same merging of the pinned dough balls rituals that overlap from Perry. Namely, they make 4 pindas. One is long, and it's like cigar shaped. They say it's coconut shaped, and then they make 3 other balls. The 3 balls are supposed to be, like the father, the grandfather, and the great-grandfather. The first thing they do is they worship all of the balls. Then they cut the long elongated one, the cigar-shaped one, the coconut-shaped one that is supposed to represent the soul of the deceased. They cut it into 3 parts. Those 3 parts are merged with those other 3 balls that are supposed to be all of the 4 bearers. And then they are all mixed together, intermingled, and then a worshiping is done of those balls, and then they are immersed in the water. And then that's it. It's great. The one individual soul has been merged with the other generations, and then all of those generations are merged together, and then they're offered into the water, and then all of the souls are intermingled, and our thoughts all dwell happily in the land of the undifferentiated ancestors. However, there's a big party coming. So this you don't see in Benares, but you do see in Gatiali in Rajasthan. You see the celebration of the Ganges. Everything is about the Ganges River, the holy river, even for these people that don't live near the holy river. In this ritual, there's actually a great amount of possession. There are 5 women who carry water pots on their head. Each pot is filled with regular water that has a few drops of that precious Ganges water that Nadu Ram brought back from Hardwar. Now, possession is actually quite common throughout India, as we'll see. We're going to have a whole module on the topic. Once you start getting into the villages or the areas that have less Brahmin-centered or Brahmin-oriented rituals, you see possession everywhere. Now, possession is not considered bad by any means, like you'd see in a Western-style horror movie. Possession is benevolent. It comes from a god or a godling that is thought to ride or enter a person who then acts for the god, shows the presence of the god, or becomes an oracle, telling about the future via the voice of God. Now, there are negative possession stories or malignant possession in which an unhappy dead person, often as suicide, will occur. But that's another story. We'll get to that in the next module. So the women and Nadu Ram, who has the original pot of water on his head, wander around the temple to Path Mother. The folk watch the women to see who's going to become possessed. Invariably, someone is going to be possessed. It's said that the bove will come, the emotion will come. When the bove comes and when the person becomes possessed, the woman will start swaying from side to side and she'll become totally wet from all of the water that she has in her head. But it's said that the way she dances and whatnot, there actually spills no water. In fact, when they get to the house, the people that's really possessed, somebody takes the pot of water and takes them to another room and clearly fills it up with water the rest of the way and says, oh, nope, not a bit of water was dropped. Okay, so women will urge on the possessed people by singing songs to Bairuji, to Bhairava, who is thought to be the attendant and servant to the Ganga in the river. Ladu Ram, and actually there's a picture of it right here. I don't know if you can see the guy in the front who's holding the end of his turban on the ground. He actually walks in front of the women and he undoes some of his turban and he sweeps the ground before the women who are possessed. This is thought to show his tremendous humility. He prostrates before them. He offers them incense. He splits coconuts. Other people do this as well. They bash coconuts and offer them to the women. Finally, the women who are possessed reach the house. The possessed woman faints and is brought back into the house. And she makes a quick recovery as everybody takes care of her and she comes back into her right mind. Finally, the final ritual we see is the turban tying ritual. So Mungilal, who was the father who died, his turban is passed around all of the men, and finally it's tied onto the head of Ladu Ram, his son. Now, this is the same as the turban tying we saw in Peri, in which we see that now that Ladu Ram has become patriarch. He's taken over for Mungilal. Next, the men come forward and they bring all these like gaudy, crazy turbans and they tie them all on top of his father's turban onto his head. Ladu Ram, wearing all these turbans, and Gold says he looks ridiculous, like his head looks all swollen and strange because he has all these turbans on, goes to the Raghunath temple. Raghunath is a Rama temple. Raghunath, the pride and lord of the Raghus, the clan of Rama. So he goes to a Rama temple. There he takes out he takes all the turbans off, whoop, like one big chunk, sets them down in front of the deity. He performs a simple ritual puja, and then he puts that lump of turbans back on his head. He goes home and worships his household deity, his clan goddess, and then his actual mother, the widow of his father. Finally, there's a giant feast that is big, it's long, and everybody has a grand time. And that's the end of things. All right, so now I'd like to take us to Tamil Nadu in the south. We're going to go to Gingi in Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu, sorry, spelled that wrong. In Tamil Nadu. All right, in our context here, we're shifting from the north to the south. And here I want to understand the reports of Clark Desais, who's doing a study of the performance of rituals that accompany, she's not studying rituals, she's studying performances that accompany the funeral rituals. The actual death rituals are the same as we saw above, so I'm not going to repeat them here. Notably, we've seen the death rituals and the merging of the pins and whatnot, and the 10 days and the 12 days and whatnot. All that is the same in Northeast, Northwest, and Southeast. So that's kind of cool. But I'm not going to repeat them here. What I want to look at is two elements and think about the nature of gender in these funeral rituals, namely women mourning and male musicians who perform in a procession. Clark Desais is trying to do an ethnography of daily life as opposed to studying a specific pilgrimage or ritual or phenomenon like she studied before when she studied possession. Clark Desais starts out by saying that the sound of monstrous wailing comes over the whole village when a death occurs. The women gather together and they sit in circles to weep and wail and cry. They have an attitude that this is their duty, that the women must all mourn for one another so that upon the time that they have a death, other women will come and mourn. So you hear the weeping, you go, if you're a woman, and you go and weep. And you go and hang out in the circle of women that weep together. And then there's a picture on the front cover right there of the women doing just that, of them sort of sitting in a circle. And they're described in the same way with a Tamil word as like cows gathered together to graze. So it's like it's women gathering together, holding one another and weeping and crying. Now, to Clark DeSaze's surprise, the women say that nobody really cries for the dead, which is the name of the book. No One Cries for the Dead: Tamil Dirges, Rowdy Songs, and Graveyard Petitions. The songs are not really about the individual who has died. They are a set of kind of common funeral songs, and they are characterized by a specific term, kurai, which means loss. What is kurai? This is a sense of loss to me from the person being gone. So they're singing about themselves and their own pain at the loss. Like, how will I live without you? How will I live without you not doing this thing for me? How can I live without your presence? You're talking about your own pain and sense of loss, that person being absent. And the goal is to inspire pity. So the idea is that by making other people feel sad through this mourning, the woman feels less pain. They feel a little bit better. They cry out that their emotions might not devour them. It's a sort of therapy. By throwing out this kurai, this sense of loss, it cools the heat of the emotion. It cools what's said to be this burning feeling they feel in the stomach, that women feel in the stomach. So loss from kurai feels like this pain. And by singing out that loss, it's thought to cool that pain. In so much of especially South Indian religion, the goal is to take hot and fiery emotions or hot and fiery goddesses and do worship to cool them down, because those hot emotions will cause affliction, just like a heated or hot or crazed goddess will cause disease, and you need to cool them down. You may remember we read about Arasi in a South Indian village, this Hindu but not but village woman we read about in Vasudha Narayana's classic article, Who Speaks for Hinduism? All right, so while they sing for themselves and to others, the chief mourner may actually appeal to relatives specifically, especially when brothers or significant kinsmen come. They'll break from the group of the women and howl and shriek and sing these songs to the brothers and significant kinsmen. And then, assuming that they begin to comfort the women who are mourning and feel pity, then the women will return to the circle of mourning and howling and wailing. Now, but what is this kurai? Kurai is a sense of there being scarcity, of there being too little, a sense of littleness, of want, of deficiency. It's a feeling of being unfulfilled, slighted, shortchanged, inadequate, or disappointed. When a brother dies, there's no one to protect her. When a husband dies, there is no one to make love to her or give her gifts. This will all be about a sense of loss, which is all too real with the loss of a person, but also the sense of loss in a woman's daily life. I know there was a Hindu family from South India that I knew very well and spent a lot of time with. And I noticed that one of the older women in the family was always describing this. I didn't have the words for it before, but she was clearly, in all of her indications, would talk about this kurai. And I would think, along with some of the other family members who are more westernized, they would say, why is this woman always it's always about a sense of loss, a sense of inadequacy. What I understand now is that she had lost her family members. And despite her being a married woman, she saw everything as being about this kurai, this sense of loss. And despite her being a Brahmin, it's interesting that she very much had this Tamil female mentality of loss and this sense of kurai. And it was only when I read this book that I finally understood more about what was going on. And instead of thinking, why is this woman just such a sad sack all the time? You realize that she's actually doing something that's very culturally distinct, because she grew up in a village in the south of India, is to express this kurai all the time, which seems odd for us who are Westerners, seems odd for us who don't have these feelings. Why? And I'm going to talk about this in a second. Why do we not have these feelings? Because our feelings and our emotions are not some universal thing. Everybody doesn't feel sadness the same way everywhere in the world. Our cultures dictate our emotions. I'll talk about this more in just a second. So what I want to note is that death for men does not change their social status. They can even gain status. Like when your father dies as a man, you take over his position. So you can gain social status when people die. But for a woman who loses her husband or her brother, like if she loses her husband, she can no longer wear jewelry and makeup. She loses her place to live. She has to either live with her in-laws or go somewhere else if she loses her husband or her brother. She loses all her social status and protections. This is true for all women when the man in her life dies. We must also note that a widow becomes a taboo figure, not allowed to wear jewelry or makeup, allowed to only wear white clothing. She loses her social status. She becomes a servant in her home, serving her in-laws because her husband is gone. She restricts her food because she is supposed to be frail and weak. She's supposed to be non-sexual in any way. Alternatively, widows can become prostitutes. All right, what about men in processions? Well, the men are another case. Here we're talking about men who are Dalits, who are outcasts, that perform these ritual parades at or after or during funerals and around funerals. As the women will weep, the men will sort of mill about in general, sort of anxiously, smoking and drinking. And soon the all-male band will come, and it's filled with drummers and singers. When the band shows up, the men crystallize their stoic resistance to grief. The drummers and singers accompany the body to the cremation ground, but they also hang around and perform while other groups show up and hang around at the home of the deceased. In fact, they have three functions. These Dalit performers, these outcast drummers and singers, announce death, draw people, because the sound of the drums and the women weeping announces that someone has died, and you can hear it from miles and miles around because the drums are so loud. And these aren't the right drums to actually show you here. I couldn't find any good pictures of these Dalit drummers that play a very specific type of very loud drums, and they often pound on them with bicycle spokes. So it's like a metal on a metal drum that makes a loud rat-a-tat-tat-tat sound. Wish I had a picture. Anyway, so they draw people there, they draw people to the home of the deceased, and they also accompany the rites. The sound of drums can be heard at a great distance, and folks show up when they hear the drums. A good death should have a big crowd to show the goodness of the one who has died. Folks show up and make gifts and offerings to the band, giving them money, and also tons and tons of arak. Arak is just country booze, moonshine, probably palm liquor. And the liquor is thought by them getting exceptionally drunk as they perform to make them feel strong, to not feel the pain in their arms from playing drums, to make their voices be more resonant, to have them ignore the sun that's beating down on them. So when these singers and drummers perform, they sing famous local songs, three of which we've actually heard before. We hear the Tamil version of Harishchandra, the king who had to sell himself and worked in a graveyard. And we read about this in Perry. We also hear the songs of the little devotee, where Shiva disguises himself as a yogi and forces people by making a request to cook and consume their own son. And finally, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to sneeze here for a second. Or maybe not. I knew this Thai Ajahn meditation teacher who would say that you would never hear him sneeze or cough, because when he had to sneeze, he would visualize a burning hot coal in his throat or in his nose, and he would breathe normally and watch that coal heat and calm, like very hot and then dull and very hot and then dull. And by doing this, he would reduce his ability to sneeze and cough. I have not mastered that trait, nor do I really care to. I kind of like sneezing and coughing personally. I like not being a monk. Anyway, so there's also a local version of the story of Kama being killed by Shiva. Now, Kama is described by Clark Deshays as the sex goddess, but it's Kama, the god of desire and sexuality. And in this sense, it is Kama's wife, Rati, and Rati means actually the pleasure of sexuality. Rati begs Kama not to go to Shiva because Shiva will kill him. There you go. Anyway, so they sing these tales, and they sing them actually in a quite vulgar manner. They actually sing and dance and tell dirty jokes, all the while that they're performing and telling these songs. So in these stories, what's the point of them? In these stories, the characters are compelled by fate and by divinity to act in a stoic manner. But in the performances, in fact, the audience is compelled by the terrible events and grief of the characters. The songs do not eulogize the dead, but they inspire emotions of loss and danger in the audience. These are tragic. So think of the story of the little devotee. One reading could be that, look at this, look at how devoted these people are to God, that they will even kill their own son and serve the son to God, or a devotee of God. They're so devoted. So this shows we need to be not attached even to our loved ones. However, so that's like one learned interpretation. But as Clark Desais starts talking to people, she realized that the people listening to the story go, oh, that'd be so painful. They have to kill their son. They lose their child out of their devotion. They're forced to lose their child. So one reading is, oh, we ought to all be like monks and be able to like give up our children at any point. And another version says, oh, this is so painful, just like the death that we've witnessed and the mourning that we're doing. See how that works? So the audience actually quite likes the songs because the characters actually struggle to let go of their loved ones, to let go of their possessions. Despite there being a rhetoric in the story about the importance of renunciation and detachment, the performers actually play up the feelings of pain and regret and mourning as people lose the ones that they kill or then die. So anyway, to make things more complicated, as I was saying, the men perform these songs by also juicing them up with dirty jokes, rowdy elements, and lewd dancing. They are seeking offerings of money due to their profound performance, but more importantly, they're seeking praise. They're seeking attention. They are seeking effusive praise on the part of the audience for their singing and their performance in a way that these outcasts and Dalits will never experience in their daily life. They will never experience being praised in this way except when they are performing. So what does all of this say about gender? Well, men are thought or are thought to be or expected to be, they're sought to be stoic. So men are to be stoic, but they also inspire intense emotions of loss and longing through their performance. The women are to wail, but they also really describe and let themselves express their lesserness, their lack, their kurai, the wanting state of being in the female condition as a Tamil woman. We can also see that old contrast that we've seen 3 times now in Ramanujan, and Ramanujan twice, in fact. And then in his essay, Is There an Indian Way of Thinking? And also his essay on Shaiva Bhakti devotional poems. We see that there is a distinction between Akal, or the interior states, and Puram, the exterior states. These are genres. The women sing out the Akal, the interior state of mourning, and the men tell these songs about gods and kings that are Puran, that are about external things to the body that happens. So we know that these genres are generally antagonistic, and they're also classical genres in Tamil poetry that every Tamil is going to know. Clark Desais engages her informants to describe their emotions, but she repeatedly realizes that because she's not Tamil, she's not from this culture, she cannot feel these emotions or find them in herself in the same way. When they say, kurai makes me burn in the stomach, she's like, I kind of get that, but I can't experience it. I can't experience it in any way. These Tamil emotions, because I'm not Tamil, I can't feel. The way that people grieve in India is different from the way that people grieve in the United States. And when I go to India and I participate in a funeral, I see people acting in all these ways, and I kind of get it, but I don't, because I'm not Indian. I'm not from that culture. I will never be able to actually understand their emotions, which leads to a greater question. Are emotions universal? Clark Desais, and I agree with it, emotions are culture specific. She makes the affect theory, or the theory about affect, the theory about emotions, which is a common style of thinking these days in the contemporary academic world. She makes this observation that our emotions are culturally determined and are not universal, and thereby our emotions are not inherently our own. This runs along the line with along the lines with a thinker named Emile Durkheim, the father of sociology, that says that we do not think. Society thinks in and through us. My thoughts and my emotions are completely conditioned by the society that I am within. There is no inherent individual who is independent from society. Who we are as people is our society. We are our society. One anthropologist, in fact, stated, and Clark Dessay cites, without our culture, we simply would not know how to feel. So this, and one other final argument, I want you to keep thinking about that. How does our culture create our emotions? Well, one other final argument I would like to make is that the band, that ritual procession, the men joking and laughing and telling these Puran stories that are about the external world instead of our interior state, they're important. They break up the mood of grief that is set by the women. The joyful procession breaks free from the limitations of grief. The grief is set out, but the transcendence of grief happens in the procession and allows us to return to the regular world. It's a full system where the women express the interior pain of mourning, and the men going forward singing these songs about society and heroicness and sexuality and jokingness and a sense of joy that allows the people to become reintegrated with the world and to escape their mourning and their grief that otherwise would be completely overwhelming. In the end, what are we left with? Men, women, and death. And it's up for us to think through what that means for all of us. And if you've gone through grief and you've gone through death and had people you know die, you're going to recognize a lot of the patterns that we've seen in this module, though they're expressed in really similar ways. Are they the same? No. Are the emotions of grief the same? No. But humans grieve. That we grieve. That is universal. That we grieve differently in every culture, and the way we grieve and the emotions we feel with grief and mourning and death, those things are conditioned by our culture. That we feel them, universal. What we feel and how we feel, absolutely different and completely conditioned by the society that we grow up in and that we live in. All right, I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.